It was late autumn on the blood-soaked soil of Western Europe, and the war thundered from every hill, every copse, every town dragged mercilessly into ruin. American tank crews, battered but resolute, steeled themselves as their columns crept through the devastation. The nightmare of Panther tanks had haunted every briefing, every quiet moment, every breath in the night. Panthers, whose thick-sloped armor was said to be invulnerable, commanded fear and respect. Veterans whispered about the unstoppable German panzers with haunted eyes, recounting tales of hopeless ambushes, of shells glancing off steel, of brothers lost in blazing, churned earth. For the Americans, facing the Panther felt like confronting a prophecy of defeat, a fate written in iron and fire, and every mile forward felt like a defiance of destiny itself. But fate, as battle so often proves, can be rewritten in the flash of a new weapon. In the frozen dawns and mud-caked fields of 1944, whispers began to ripple through the ranks. A new shell had arrived, a projectile of uncanny speed and terrifying penetrative power. The 76mm HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing. Tales of American tanks that had struggled for months, suddenly blasting holes through Panther's legendary armor, raced from mouth to mouth. Hope born from destruction, ignited in the hearts of crews grown weary from loss. Suddenly the question at every campfire shifted from, how can we survive them, to is this the edge we've pleaded for? Imagine the scene. An American Sherman, its olive hull splattered with the black rain of war, stalks a German Panther at the edge of a shattered village. The Panther's commander trusts his armor, his tactical advantage, the myth of invulnerability. The American loader readies the HVAP shell. Its tungsten core glitters dimly in the gloom, a symbol of the desperate technological race. The gunner lines up the shot, heart pounding, hands trembling, every muscle alive with adrenaline and fear. The shell slams home, the barrel recoils, and then skyfire. The HVAP round screams through the air, its velocity almost supernatural. For a moment, nothing. The world holds its breath. And then the impact. Panther armor, once the specter of Allied defeat, blisters and cracks. The shell rips through the frontal plate, tearing the very promise of German supremacy apart. Inside, the shock ricochets through the crew, their certainty shattered in an instant. The American tankers barely have time to process that they are now the hunters, not the hunted. Word spreads. Outrage and disbelief ripple through German command. How could their wonder weapon be so swiftly undermined by a single innovation? The psychological warfare was as sharp as any shell fragment. German tank crews, long reassured by technical superiority, now found themselves second-guessing every advance, feeling exposed beneath armor that had become, in the calculus of modern battle, suddenly vulnerable. American crews, once haunted by inevitable defeat, now tasted a strange electric hope, their courage redoubled, their resolve crystallizing into fierce determination. Historians debate the moment the tide truly turned, but many agree that the arrival of effective HVAP rounds marked a pivotal shift. No longer did Panther tanks roam the battlefield with impunity. The virtual armor of myth had been punctured, and with it, the psychological edge that had kept American crews on the defensive. Each engagement from then on was a test, a contest not of faith in steel alone, but of innovation, adaptability, and raw nerve. Every HVAP shell fired was a message to Berlin. The Allies had leveled the playing field, and every day forward grew darker for the defenders of the Reich. Yet the birth of hope did not come without sacrifice. Tungsten, the precious metal at the heart of HVAP rounds, was rare and exorbitantly expensive to source. Not every Sherman could carry the miracle shell, and commanders were forced to ration ammunition, choosing targets of opportunity with ruthless calculation. The tension between possibility and scarcity drew American tankers into agonizing decisions. When to fire, when to hold. What Panther, what Tiger, what fearsome behemoth was worthy of the shell that could pierce the armor and the soul of the enemy? In the months that followed, battle reports grew ever more dramatic. Stories of Sherman's besting Panthers spread through mess halls and bivouacs, stoking the fire of Allied will. German commanders scrambled to adapt, to shift tactics, to counteract the loss of their psychological, if not physical, advantage. Secret directives ordered Panther crews to avoid confrontation, to rely on ambush and cunning rather than brute strength. The war of armor shifted into a war of nerves, with HVAP rounds serving as the ghostly arbiters of fate. The conflict had evolved, now less about machines and more about the spirits and strategies of the men who drove them. And so, the chapter closes on a single, stunning moment, the shattering of the Panthers' armor, both physical and legendary. The introduction of the 76mm HVAP shell did not merely change the outcome of firefights. It changed minds, rewrote destinies, transformed defeat into possibility. For American tank crews, every shell was hope. Every engagement a chance to reshape the narrative of war itself. Yet even as the sun set over crushed towns and burning fields, as the cost in lives and courage climbed ever higher, one truth had been made clear. Sometimes, it is not the armor you wear, but the idea you shatter. That decides the outcome of war. The prophecy of defeat was broken, not by fate alone, but by the relentless urge to innovate and the courage to seize the moment, one tungsten core shell at a time. As the world's eyes shifted anxiously to the mechanical monsters prowling across Europe, beneath that outward clash of iron, a subtler war of minds and materials ignited. The American tank crews trembled before the daunting might of the Panther, its armor a fortress seemingly impossible to breach. But the story of the 76mm HVAP shell, the very projectile that would slice through this myth, begins not with bravado, but with painstaking science, innovation, and a race against German ingenuity. Each round was evolution fired from the heart of industry. It was the urgent answer to the prayers of soldiers, desperate for hope, where once there had been resignation. For months following the Normandy landings, Allied crews reported their shells bouncing harmlessly off Panther turrets and glacis, sometimes failing even at point-blank range. Panic spread among the ranks and upper echelons of command, demanding a solution that could lift the specter of defeat. Engineers within the American Ordnance Department struggled, poring over data sheets, ballistics tables, and battlefield reports. What lay between survival and annihilation was a few millimeters of steel and the laws of physics. Thus began the fervent development of the 76mm gun M1, seeking to surpass the older 75mm that had equipped most Shermans and result in a weapon the Germans had not anticipated. Yet sheer caliber was not enough. Even the new high-velocity projectiles made of hardened steel sputtered in the face of advanced Panther armor. What could pierce the heart of a machine constructed for resilience, designed to withstand every conventional shell in Allied inventories? The answer came in the shimmering form of tungsten. Tungsten carbide, denser than lead, harder than steel, and ferociously resilient. American scientists realized that if they could concentrate all the kinetic energy into a pinpoint core, shade unnecessary mass and speed up the projectile, the laws of physics could shift the balance. The resulting shell, the M93 HVAP high-velocity armor-piercing, was a revelation. It did not rely on brute force alone, but rather cunning design. A small tungsten core surrounded by a lightweight aluminum sabot and ballistic windshield. When fired, the core rocketed forward with staggering speed, achieving a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second, outstripping every conventional round in the Allies' arsenal. Compared to the standard M62 APC rounds, 792 meters per second, this technological leap transformed the possibility of penetration from a desperate gamble to a calculated certainty. American tankers learned quickly. With the HVAP loaded, the odds changed. At 1,000 meters, the M93 could penetrate up to 178 millimeters of armor, placed at a 0-degree angle, enough to punch clean through the Panther's frontal plating, previously a fortress against Allied shells. The first tests on the proving grounds became legend among crews. Stories of rounds cleaving straight through heavy steel, producing gaping wounds in targets once believed invulnerable, spread rapidly. The myth of the Panther as an unstoppable juggernaut began to crumble, and German commanders realized with grim clarity that their edge in armor was compromised. Yet innovation exacts a price. Tungsten was precious, difficult to source, critical for wartime industries, and hoarded for the most dire needs. American logistics wrestled with the dilemma. Who deserved these miracle shells? Would they reach the front in time or be lost in labyrinthine supply chains? Tank commanders rationed the rounds like gold, reserving them for Panther encounters, Tiger engagements, and the moments that might tip the fate of a town or a squadron. On the ground, this scarcity created its own drama. Crews would sometimes fire the standard APC rounds first, praying the enemy exposed a weak spot, before resorting to HVAP only when no other choice remained. Dimly lit tank interiors became scenes of whispered arguments. Should the HVAP be loaded now or held for later? Letters from the front lines reveal the tension, relief mixed with agony, the knowledge that salvation lay in the shell wreck behind them, but only for 1 or 2 shots. Meanwhile, as combat raged on, the Germans watched uneasily. Panther engineers sought ways to adapt. Some attempted to up-armor critical sections, while others relied on tactical deception, choosing terrain and positioning to lessen the exposure of vulnerable zones. Tank crews received new instructions: avoid direct duels with American tanks at medium ranges, draw the enemy into ambushes, and lean on the psychological warfare that had long aided them. The mere sight of a Panther still instilled dread. In American ranks, every confirmed penetration was an anthem of hope. The data echoed across battlefields. The M93's impact speed and penetrative power changed the way engagements played out. Skirmishes that once ended in burning Shermans now saw Panthers disabled, crews fleeing, and advances continuing where before there had only been stalemate and retreat. Historians would later pinpoint these technological victories as essential to crippling German armored strategy, reconstructing the moment when HVAP arrived as a turning point for morale as much as mechanics. The science of penetration had become the art of survival. Every equation scribbled on a blackboard stateside, every round shipped across stormy seas, every tungsten shipment processed for war, reverberated through the tank battles that shaped the final years of the conflict. With each blast that sent steel hissing through Panther hulls, American crews learned to trust not only their resolve, but the relentless ingenuity of the minds laboring behind the front lines. Yet, with every shot fired, the stakes grew more urgent. The Germans, now deprived of certainty, grasped for new answers, accelerating tactical adaptation and warning. The war's narrative twisted, no longer a march of unstoppable machines, but a contest defined by the fragile supremacy of innovation. The 76mm HVAP shell became a symbol, not just of survival and victory, but of the profound interplay between science and fate, courage and calculation. As wave after wave of engagements unsettled the balance, American tank crews faced each battle with trembling anticipation. The science that had given birth to HVAP did more than pierce armor. It rewrote the psychological script of the battlefield. Each time the Panther's shield was shattered, a prophecy was defied, and a new chapter in the saga of armored warfare was inscribed with urgency and awe. And so, as the war thundered onward, the science of penetration proved not simply the edge between life and death, but the force that could shatter prophecies and legends, one shell, one spark, one act of innovation at a time. On a frost-laced dawn, as the Battle of the Bulge raged with merciless intensity, a convoy of American Shermans maneuvered cautiously through Belgium's battered forests. The air was thick with uncertainty. The rumor of German Panthers prowling nearby was enough to knot every man's gut. They had all heard the stories. The Panthers, nearly invisible in winter camouflage, could shrug off all but the heaviest Allied shells, turning every tank duel into a haphazard gamble with fate. What few realized in that anxious moment was the revolution underway. A revolution not of overwhelming numbers or bold flanking maneuvers, but in the shining core of the shells now loaded in their guns. The new HVAP ammunition would soon set shockwaves rippling through the armored warriors of the Reich, forever changing combat psychology and the outcome of fiery duels across Europe. The first real test came as American crews confronted German Panthers head-on in desperate defense of a snowy crossroads, a vital artery in that chaotic campaign. The German tanks advanced methodically, their crews confident in the armor that had protected them in countless prior battles. American loaders whispered HVAP with reverence, sliding the tungsten-filled rounds home with hands shaking between hope and terror. Could a piece of American science truly defy the German legend that haunted every Allied plan? It began with a blinding flash. The Sherman's 76mm M1 barked, sending an M93 HVAP shell screaming towards the Panther's frontal slope, an iron curtain once thought to be invulnerable. For a heartbeat, time froze. The Panther's steel wall spattered, then caved. The shell punched through, leaving a ragged black wound. The Germans inside, battle-hardened and sure of their technological edge, were stunned into paralysis. This was no ricochet, no futile ping. It was a direct violation of the myth. American science had found a way in. What followed was clamorous disbelief. Word spread rapidly down German lines. Reports circulated of Sherman shells that could pierce even the thickest mantlet at up to 1,000 yards. Their kinetic might so profound it threatened not only lives, but the psychological vice grip of German armor supremacy, Webrun. Panther crews found themselves hesitating, seeking cover not through choice but necessity. For the first time, the iron promise of safety was compromised by enemy ingenuity. On the American side, exhilaration and nerves battled for dominance. Tank commanders, long forced to rely on maneuver and luck, realized that victory might now hinge upon a single precious round. Supply officers recounted frantic requests for more HVAP, but logistics lagged behind demand. Each tank was rationed a handful of the prized ammunition, some receiving just 5 shells a month, and sometimes only during critical operations. Crews debated every shot fired, knowing that each HVAP round was worth its weight in gold, perhaps the difference between life and death. As the encounters mounted, tales of HVAP impacts accumulated with the gravity of legend. American tankers witnessed firsthand the surreal spectacle of Panther armor yielding at the seams. Heavy German steel bent, cracked, and shattered by the sheer velocity and density of tungsten. In post-action analyses, ordnance officers studied wrecked Panthers with forensic precision. Penetrations were not just through weak points, but through the previously untouchable mantlet and turret face, especially when struck at a favorable angle. The shell was most effective within 1,000 meters, and at ranges beyond, it could still cripple tracks and gun barrels, reducing the Panther to a blunt and desperate shell web. Yet even as success blossomed, limitations were revealed. The Panther's glacis, angled and thick, was still a formidable obstacle. Shots that struck the hull front at poor angles often failed, reinforcing the doctrine that emphasized flanking and maneuver to expose vulnerable spots. American gunners were trained to exploit these lessons, using every ounce of tactical creativity to create opportunities for HVAP to work its wonder. Every briefing became an exercise in hope and fear, as crews balanced their few miracle rounds with the brutal reality of battlefield chaos. For German crews, the psychological toll was immense. Confidence, once the product of technical superiority, crumbled in the face of shells that violated every expectation. Some Panther commanders began to avoid direct duels, seeking terrain that would minimize exposure, or relying on ambush as their last sanctuary. Propaganda, once a weapon of reassurance, could not disguise the increasing vulnerability. The myth of invincibility evaporated, replaced with dread and suspicion. Every Sherman in the distance might now possess the power to kill. The shockwaves extended beyond the front. Army groups re-evaluated tactics and procurement. American commanders pressed urgently for every tank arriving in Europe to be armed with a 76mm gun, seeing the critical impact of HVAP against the heaviest German armor web. The transformation was not just material or technical, but spiritual, a deep realignment of morale, doctrine, and survival instincts. Germans with HVAP rounds became symbols of resistance, beacons of hope in a campaign that had often felt hopeless. As the winter battles of 1944 and 1945 bled into spring, the legend of the HVAP shell grew. In roadside skirmishes and epic counterattacks, American tankers found themselves fighting not just for tactical victory, but for an emotional rewrite of the war's narrative. Each successful penetration was a message. Invincibility was obsolete, and every prophecy of defeat could be shattered by innovation, courage, and the relentless will to survive. By the time the smoke cleared over Europe's ruins, the battlefield shockwaves radiating from those first HVAP impacts had done more than kill tanks. They had transformed the very foundation of armored warfare. The men who loaded and fired those shells bore witness to the moment history bent beneath tungsten and hope. The myth of German armor supremacy had been cracked, not through brute force or numbers alone, but by the singular collision of innovation and human resolve. And as both sides counted their losses and dreamed their dreams of victory and vengeance, a new prophecy was carved into memory. No armor, however legendary, could withstand forever the relentless advance of desperate ingenuity. The arrival of the 76mm HVAP shell did more than just reshape hardware. It inverted the very doctrine under which American tank crews fought and sparked a bold recalibration in the psyche of soldiers on both sides. Gone were the days when Allied tankers approached Panther shadows with dread bordering on fatalism. Now, thanks to a fusion of battlefield experience, tactical innovation, and specialized ammunition, a new resolve grew, one where initiative, teamwork, and calculated risk became the American answer to German steel. Early in the Normandy campaign, American tank columns had been rigid, their confidence battered by shell after shell bounding uselessly off Panther glasses. Tank commanders learned to fear the telltale crack of German 75mm projectiles, ripping through their own lines, each loss reinforcing a doctrine rooted in caution and concealment. Tank duels were rare and usually avoided if possible. Destruction of Panthers generally fell to coordinated ambushes with tank destroyers, airstrikes, or artillery barrages rather than direct confrontation. Webtown. Yet by late 1944 and into 1945, as more tanks received the 76mm gun and word of HVAP's performance spread from the Ardennes to the rolling plains of Germany, the American approach shifted dramatically. Training fields across England and France echoed with the clatter of spent brass and furious orders. Squadron leaders, once focused solely on survival, now analyzed terrain as opportunities, not just obstacles. They mapped the likely lines of Panther attack, practiced rapid realignments of their hulls, and drilled relentlessly for the crucial seconds a favorable shot would last. The high-velocity HVAP shell demanded dexterity and ingenuity. American gunners were schooled to look beyond direct confrontations, often impossible given the frontal protection of the Panther, and instead employ their Sherman's mobility, flanking fast through bocage or ruined villages to assail the Panther's side or rear armor. When the opportunity arose, a tungsten core round delivered with accuracy could shatter even the most revered target. Doctrine demanded patience for these moments and an end to the despair that had once greeted German advances. The psychological impact reverberated through ranks and up the chain of command. Tank crews who had once dreaded the next engagement with a mixture of numbness and apprehension now faced their foes with a measured anticipation. After-action reports chronicled an increasing tendency to counterattack rather than retreat, to maneuver boldly in the knowledge that victory, even if rare, was possible. The combined effects of air superiority, artillery mass, and improved ammunition gave new hope and inspiration to Allied crews. But the transformation was not limited to tanks alone. HVAP's introduction electrified the whole ecosystem of American armored warfare. Infantry units came to trust their armor support anew, seeing Shermans as more than mobile targets or sources of cover. Tank destroyer battalions, equipped with the M18 Hellcat and M36 Jackson, saw their own missions amplified, as their 76mm and 90mm guns, also benefiting from specialized ammunition, became the cutting-edge spear points in desperate anti-tank duels. On the German side, the shock was palpable. Commanders counseled a new caution. Panther platoons learned to fight in packs and to build complex defenses with overlapping fields of fire, cunning trap lanes, and camouflaged positions. Hold-down and reverse slope tactics proliferated, and no longer did the sight of an American tank always prompt a headlong charge into battle. This strategic shift was in itself a testament to the effectiveness of the HVAP shell. Doctrine evolved, not solely from destroyed panzers, but from the fear and uncertainty the ammunition inspired among even the most elite German crews. As the Allies pushed deeper into the heart of Germany in the war's final months, the clash between new doctrine and enduring myth intensified. Tank crews pushed their machines and themselves to the limits. In rapid, risky forays through shattered cities and woodlands, ingenuity and improvisation were prized above rigid discipline. Leaders devolved decision-making into the hands of the men inside the steel hulls, trusting that their intimate knowledge of gun, shell, and enemy would tip the balance when opportunity flashed. Yet there were still moments of heartbreak and frustration. Scarcity of tungsten, misallocated supply, and the ever-present threat of ambush meant tactical finesse was as essential as any technical advantage. In the end, it was not always the tank with the hardest punch that survived, But the crew that thought fastest fought hardest and adapted with every thunderous heartbeat of mechanized war. As May 1945 approached, with shattered columns of Panthers retreating before the Allied juggernaut and the remnants of German resistance crumbling, the legacy of tactical evolution was plain to see. The American armored force, once stung by crisis and defeat, had become a crucible of innovation and courage. Every engagement, every flanking maneuver, every last HVAP shell fired was proof. The doctrine of survival had been obliterated, replaced by a doctrine of audacity, ingenuity, and belief that tomorrow's battle could be won if only today's lesson was learned. The result was a living testament to the power of adaptation. The 76mm HVAP shell, both literally and figuratively, had shattered armor and prophecy alike, leaving the commanders and tankers who wielded it forever changed by the unforgiving tests of their time. The arrival of the 76mm HVAP shell did more than just reshape hardware. It inverted the very doctrine under which American tank crews fought and sparked a bold recalibration in the psyche of soldiers on both sides. Gone were the days when Allied tankers approached Panther shadows with dread bordering on fatalism. Now, thanks to a fusion of battlefield experience, tactical innovation, and specialized ammunition, a new resolve grew, one where initiative, teamwork, and calculated risk became the American answer to German steel. Early in the Normandy campaign, American tank columns had been rigid, their confidence battered by shell after shell bounding uselessly off Panther glasses. Tank commanders learned to fear the telltale crack of German 75mm projectiles, ripping through their own lines, each loss reinforcing a doctrine rooted in caution and concealment. Tank duels were rare and usually avoided if possible. Destruction of Panthers generally fell to coordinated ambushes with tank destroyers, airstrikes, or artillery barrages rather than direct confrontation. Webtown. Yet by late 1944 and into 1945, as more tanks received the 76mm gun and word of HVAP's performance spread from the Ardennes to the rolling plains of Germany, the American approach shifted dramatically. Training fields across England and France echoed with the clatter of spent brass and furious orders. Squadron leaders, once focused solely on survival, now analyzed terrain as opportunities, not just obstacles. They mapped the likely lines of Panther attack, practiced rapid realignments of their hulls, and drilled relentlessly for the crucial seconds a favorable shot would last. The high-velocity HVAP shell demanded dexterity and ingenuity. American gunners were schooled to look beyond direct confrontations, often impossible given the frontal protection of the Panther, and instead employ their Sherman's mobility, flanking fast through bocage or ruined villages to assail the Panther's side or rear armor. When the opportunity arose, a tungsten core round delivered with accuracy could shatter even the most revered target. Doctrine demanded patience for these moments and an end to the despair that had once greeted German advances. The psychological impact reverberated through ranks and up the chain of command. Tank crews who had once dreaded the next engagement, with a mixture of numbness and apprehension, now faced their foes with a measured anticipation. After-action reports chronicled an increasing tendency to counterattack rather than retreat, to maneuver boldly in the knowledge that victory, even if rare, was possible. The combined effects of air superiority, artillery mass, and improved ammunition gave new hope and inspiration to Allied crews. But the transformation was not limited to tanks alone. HVAP's introduction electrified the whole ecosystem of American armored warfare. Infantry units came to trust their armor support anew, seeing Shermans as more than mobile targets or sources of cover. Tank destroyer battalions, equipped with the M18 Hellcat and M36 Jackson, saw their own missions amplified, as their 76mm and 90mm guns, also benefiting from specialized ammunition, became the cutting-edge spear points in desperate anti-tank duels. On the German side, the shock was palpable. Commanders counseled a new caution. Panther platoons learned to fight in packs and to build complex defenses with overlapping fields of fire, cunning trap lanes, and camouflaged positions. Hold-down and reverse slope tactics proliferated, and no longer did the sight of an American tank always prompt a headlong charge into battle. This strategic shift was, in itself, a testament to the effectiveness of the HVAP shell. Doctrine evolved, not solely from destroyed Panthers, but from the fear and uncertainty the ammunition inspired among even the most elite German crews. As the Allies pushed deeper into the heart of Germany in the war's final months, the clash between new doctrine and enduring myth intensified. Tank crews pushed their machines and themselves to the limits. In rapid, risky forays through shattered cities and woodlands, ingenuity and improvisation were prized above rigid discipline. Leaders devolved decision-making into the hands of the men inside the steel hulls, trusting that their intimate knowledge of gun, shell, and enemy would tip the balance when opportunity flashed. Yet there were still moments of heartbreak and frustration. Scarcity of tungsten, misallocated supply, and the ever-present threat of ambush meant tactical finesse was as essential as any technical advantage. In the end, it was not always the tank with the hardest punch that survived, but the crew that thought fastest, fought hardest, and adapted with every thunderous heartbeat of mechanized war. As May 1945 approached, with shattered columns of Panthers retreating before the Allied juggernaut and the remnants of German resistance crumbling, the legacy of tactical evolution was plain to see. The American armored force, once stung by crisis and defeat, had become a crucible of innovation and courage. Every engagement, every flanking maneuver, every last HVAP shell fired was proof. The doctrine of survival had been obliterated, replaced by a doctrine of audacity, ingenuity, and belief that tomorrow's battle could be won if only today's lesson was learned. The result was a living testament to the power of adaptation. The 76mm HVAP shell, both literally and figuratively, had shattered armor and prophecy alike, leaving the commanders and tankers who wielded it forever changed by the unforgiving tests of their time. From the tumultuous dawn of the HVAP shell's introduction to the thunderous final engagements on German soil, the weapon's legacy was forged as much in statistics and measurement as it was in myth and memory. Engineers, officers, and historians alike have pored over the data, looking beyond heroic tales, in the quest to discover just how decisively this innovation altered the mathematics of armored warfare. When the dust settled and the numbers were laid bare, one truth rang out. In the contest of iron and will, statistical supremacy mattered just as much as courage. At the cold heart of HVAP's innovation lay a series of numerical marvels. The 76mm M93 HVAP shell emerged as one of the highest velocity anti-tank rounds of its era, boasting over 1,036 meters per second at the muzzle web. The figures impressed not only American gunners, but also startled German commanders. At 1,000 meters, an M62 armor-piercing capped round could penetrate 190mm of armor, yet the M93 HVAP could punch through an extraordinary 178mm web spow. Against the armor of a Panther tank, this increased penetrative power meant that the shell could threaten virtually every part of the German beast, short of its heavily angled glacis plate. For tank commanders and battlefield planners, these numbers heralded a revolution in doctrine. Each American Sherman equipped with HVAP rounds carried a possibility never available before: direct confrontation with the most infamous German armor at combat ranges, puncturing steel that had repelled every previous projectile. This paradigm shift manifested in both tactical and operational statistics. Data reveals a marked rise in Panther casualties after HVAP deployment, with numerous confirmed penetrations where standard rounds would have failed in. In the deadly calculus of attrition, the Allies gained an edge that reshaped the front. Yet in the crucible of war, performance was always more nuanced than laboratory data. Real battlefields were chaotic. Range, angle, armor condition, crew decision, and luck intertwined to produce outcomes that sometimes defied expectations. The Panther's glacis, sloped at 55 degrees and 80mm thick, could frequently defeat even HVAP at common engagement distances. Many duels still ended in ricochets or glancing blows, reinforcing the endless importance of angles, positioning, and tactical cunning. Soviet penetration tables and American field manuals codified HVAP's strengths and limitations, teaching gunners to seek the turret or lower hull, or maneuver for a lateral shot whenever possible. The ammunition's arrival also triggered a host of logistical and operational adaptations. Tungsten remained a rare commodity, with each round rationed, tracked and sometimes prioritized for units expected to face Panther concentrations. Armored units on the Western Front reported receiving as few as 5 HVAP shells per tank per month, leading to strategic decision-making and sometimes frantic requests for additional stocks. The scarcity shaped battlefield outcomes, driving innovation and careful husbandry of the Army's deadliest asset. As HVAP infiltrated the arsenal, not only did American tank losses to Panthers decrease, but broader trends in armored warfare began to shift. The presence of the shell forced German tactical evolution, pushing Panzers to hull-down positions, ambush tactics, and avoidance of direct duels. Data from combat logs revealed a decline in tank-on-tank engagements, favoring bold frontal attacks. Instead, tanks hunted each other in a careful ballet of flanking, maneuvering for the one golden opportunity to fire an HVAP round at an exposed panel web. The new weapon likewise created a ripple effect among Allied planners. The operational tempo sped up, as commanders found that the mere rumor of HVAP ammunition forced enemy tanks into defensive postures, reducing their mobility and stifling the initiative. During Ardennes and Ruhr campaigns, American advances accelerated where HVAP stocks were available, allowing units to clear opposition more swiftly and with fewer casualties. Battlefield success drew as much from logistics and foresight as raw nerve. Every shell counted toward the unfolding outcome. As the final weeks of war approached, post-action analysis became the order of the day. Statisticians and ordnance officers meticulously catalogued penetrations, hits, misses, and catastrophic armor failures. Data was compiled from Normandy to Berlin, merging technical performance records with combat accounts. The result? A compelling tapestry of testament to the symbiotic power of technology and tactical flexibility. While HVAP shells alone did not ensure victory, their proper use alongside audacious tactics, effective reconnaissance and combined arms support became key elements in overturning the Panthers' dominance. Numbers, of course, cannot capture all the nuances of battle, but they distill the hard lessons learned in blood and sweat. At the intersection of engineering, planning, and survival, the HVAP's true legacy is not just in penetrative millimeters or muzzle velocities, but in the lived experience of crews who saw the myth of German armor broken before their eyes. The tables, charts, and logs remain etched in the history of armored war, a testimony to the idea that every advantage, however fleeting, must be seized and multiplied. And so, as historians look back on the era of high-velocity shells and desperate confrontation, they find that statistical supremacy was not simply a footnote, it was a prophecy fulfilled. For each crew that loaded a tungsten core round and faced the shadows of enemy armor, the outcome of war was measured not only in courage, but in the relentless math of possibility, risk, and determination. The powerful promise of the HVAP shell was not merely a story of physics or battlefield tactics. It became a saga of industry, logistics, and desperate resourcefulness. At its core, every HVAP round was a marvel of wartime engineering, a lightweight aluminum body, a ballistic windshield, and a dense tungsten core. Yet the same precious tungsten that turned Allied guns into Panther killers was fiercely contested in laboratories and supply depots across continents, a resource so critical, its scarcity stamped every chapter of the shell's story. In the chaos of World War II, the Allied war machine strained to meet the demand for high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition. British, Soviet, American, and even German planners grasped the unmistakable advantages of tungsten-cored shot. But the mineral itself was rare, difficult to mine, and subject to lengthy refinement. Each round demanded a logistical miracle just to reach the front. Battles over supply chains and trade routes soon mirrored those fought in trenches and on tank hulls. The United States, possessing a modest domestic supply and dependent on imports from South America and China, found every shipment shadowed by risk and uncertainty. As engineers finalized the design for the M93 HVAP shell and orders for production skyrocketed, new headaches emerged. Initial directives called for the creation of 20,000 rounds and then a target of 43,000 per month, but reality quickly intervened. Record production hovered far below target, with less than 10,000 HVAP shells reaching units monthly. by late 1944, barely a trickle compared to the furious demand on the battlefront, Webb and Sal. Every barrel loaded with tungsten represented countless hours of negotiation, import, refinement, and risk. The Army responded with draconian rationing measures, directing units to guard their tungsten rounds like gold. Germans might be issued only 5 or 6 HVAP shells before a major operation, and requests for resupply were subject to stringent review. Some tank destroyer battalions received more, owing to their specialized role in anti-tank warfare, but for most crews, each tungsten-cored projectile was a rare luxury, fired only in the most desperate combat or against the most dangerous foe. Webb mice. Webb 34, the pressure for tungsten, transformed industrial relationships. American planners negotiated fiercely with strategic partners in Bolivia, Brazil, and China, whose ores became lifelines to the war effort. On occasion, supply ships bypassed more critical cargoes just to deliver the mineral. In the background, a shadow conflict raged as the Axis powers sought to disrupt shipments by submarines, spies, and embargoes. Soviet engineers, facing similar shortages, sometimes resorted to less effective steel substitutes, impacting their own APCR programs. Production bottlenecks spurred further innovation. Chemists and metallurgists raced to improve refining methods, seeking ways to squeeze more useful tungsten from every ton of ore. Engineers experimented with aerodynamic tweaks. Some shells incorporated adjustable nose plugs or altered core geometry to conserve tungsten while retaining penetrative might web. Every gram of the mineral was measured and tracked with near-religious intensity. On the battlefield, rationing shaped tactics and morale. Crews debated endlessly whether to fire HVAP in the first moments of an ambush or reserve it for the one shot that might decide victory. Commanders sometimes calculated a unit's expected tungsten expenditure before launching an attack, factoring in the possibility of Panther, Tiger, or new German armor appearing in the line of march. Yet the tungsten race spurred creativity, not just constraint. As American forges turned out new batches of HVAP, tankers developed clever methods for maximizing results. Flanking maneuvers, coordinated target identification, and careful synchronization with supporting arms all ensured that each shell struck the most vital spot. The story of supply became the story of ingenuity. Each round fired was backed by sweat and strategy from mine to muzzle. German forces, for their part, monitored intelligence reports with increasing anxiety. As rumors of Allied tungsten shipments and new shell types filtered into planning rooms, Panther and Tiger battalions received stern directives to rely on deception, ambush and terrain, never to assume that mere armor would save them. The result was a new phase of psychological conflict, as both sides raced for not just firepower, but the material muscle to wield it. The closing chapters of HVAP's wartime career were marked by bittersweet success. Where supply kept pace with demand, American and Allied armor pushed forward, toppling the legend of German invincibility and breaking key defenses. Where shortages bit deep, tankers improvised, relying on standard shells maneuver and the old virtues of luck and courage. Victory was weighed by the metric ton, etched in the ledgers of quartermasters as much as the annals of heroism. After the war, the legacy of tungsten persisted. Chemists, economists, and engineers reflected on the mineral's wartime journey, from obscure ore to the heart of victory. The HVAP shell, in its rarity and might, became a symbol of resourcefulness under fire, proof that winning the race for critical materials could be as decisive as any battle fought in mud or flame. The supply chains, contracts, and technological advances it inspired shaped peacetime industry, all rooted in the urgent lessons learned as Allied tankers waited anxiously for their next shipment of hope. In this crucible, the race for tungsten and the struggle to deliver HVAP marked the intersection of human ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the unforgiving arithmetic of war. It stands as testament. Often the battles unseen in mines, factories, boardrooms are those that shape the fate of soldiers far ahead. For the Sherman's crew clutching their handful of HVAP shells, every round loaded, was the culmination of 1,000 lives and a worldwide struggle. Every trigger squeeze was legacy realized in tungsten and fire. As the cannons fell silent over the ruined cities of Germany, and the armor-piercing thunder of HVAP rounds faded into memory, the ultimate reckoning of the 76mm high-velocity shell unfolded far beyond the battlefield. The journey of the HVAP, from desperate improvisation through technological marvel to coveted legend, became not just a story of one nation's industrial might or tactical ingenuity, but a lasting symbol in the grand theater of 20th century war. Production figures underscore the scale of this achievement and its limits. Initial hopes for tens of thousands of HVAP shells monthly were never realized. Despite enormous effort, American industry struggled to balance the twin demands of frontline supply and strategic resource allocation. In 1944-1945, actual HVAP output for 76mm guns ramped from a few hundred per month to perhaps 7,000 at its peak, with a wartime total for the ETO of around 33,000 by war's end, enough to make a difference, but never enough to erase risk or scarcity. Tungsten's rarity imposed strict limits, and as a result, the vast majority of Shermans on the front lines went to war with standard armor-piercing rounds. Only the luckiest or most important units ever saw significant supplies of the miracle shells, and yet, for those who inherited even a few HVAP rounds, their experience shaped memories that would echo for generations. Veterans recounted the awe of watching shells, once thought hopeless, arcing through the fearsome flesh of German steel. Others remembered the frustration of rationing, of knowing that in the crucial second, hope might be spent with the last tungsten core. The legend was forged as much in anticipation and anxiety as in triumphant shots. Post-war, the legacy of the M93 HVAP endured. Tank designers and ordnance engineers pored over battle damage reports and captured Panthers, drawing lessons for the armaments of the Cold War and beyond. The first-hand data collected during the campaigns of 1944 and 1945 led directly to improvements in American armor and future ammunition. Developments like the post-war M319 APCR, armor-piercing, composite rigid round, improvements in tungsten core manufacturing, and hard-won experience in supply chain management all bear the imprint of the late-war struggle for armored superiority. The vast armored graveyards of Europe reveal this history in steel. Panther tanks blasted open at the seams by a shot at the right place and moment, Shermans singed and scarred where luck ran out, fragments of tungsten buried in fields which once staged the grand gamble between doctrinal faith and industrial innovation. The records show that despite all limits, HVAP rounds accounted for a disproportional number of Panther kills relative to mere numbers supplied. Fight. The memory of their power, real, imagined, exaggerated, or underestimated, inevitably colored the legend for both sides. For German veterans, the arrival of HVAP was a bitter lesson in humility. Panther crews quickly learned to fear American tanks in ways they never had before, and this psychological wound bled into the planning of future generations. Training manuals were rewritten, doctrine revised, and armor designs began to take new threats into account. The sight of a Sherman suddenly became a question mark, not an afterthought, a closing of the gap between perceived invulnerability and sobering reality. The end of the conflict did not see the HVAP story recede, but rather broaden into a mythos underpinning World War II's most dramatic armored narratives. Writers, modelers, wargamers, and historians debated the real statistics of pennant armor, the accounts of duels fought at impossible angles, the stories of tanks crippled or destroyed by tungsten that seemed almost magical in its power. The HVAP became at once history and parable, an emblem of racing desperation, last-minute brilliance, and the enduring contest between offense and defense. On a technical level, the experience shaped peacetime industries too. The mining, refinement, and use of tungsten became central to the military supply chains and industrial economy of post-war America. The logistical scars of the HVAP campaign led to greater collaboration with global partners in strategic minerals and new research in aerodynamic shell design, metallurgy, and ballistics. Many who had labored over these innovations in the factories and laboratories would go on to define the early decades of the Cold War, drawing on the wartime lessons written in urgency, but most enduring of all was the lesson HVAP imparted, that in the chaos and crucible of war, success belongs to those capable of adapting, solving, and relentlessly pushing at the boundaries of possibility. Where myth encountered math, where the prophecy of German invincibility met with American innovation, the metal was tested, and the narrative forever changed. For the crew of the Sherman, clutching their handful of hypervelocity shells, memories remain as vivid as the explosions that once lit the battlefields. HVAP was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a promise, a point of hope snatched from the jaws of defeat and hammered into legend by courage, science, and sacrifice. The story endures in the memory of survivors and the cold calculus of numbers, as a whisper to every future generation. The fate of armies and indeed of nations rests not merely in what is assumed invincible, but in the courage to dream, the will to change, and the relentless quest for the one idea, the one innovation that can pierce even the hardest armor. If you've stood with us through the thunder of history, you know there's always more beneath the surface. Hit subscribe now and ring the bell, because every story of war, courage, and consequence deserves to be told. Join our ranks, dive deep into the untold battles, and become part of the mission to remember. Your next chapter starts here.